Good evening, everyone. If I can have your attention. My name is Brian McGraw. I am the chair of the Politics and International Relations Department here at Wheaton College and Dean of Social Science and Education, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event. A few orientation notes just for the event. As the sign said, we are sort of masking indoors, following the Illinois Department of Public Health sort of rules. You should have received a card as you walked in. That card has a little QR code on it. If the last little bit of tonight's event will be Q&A from the audience. If you'll submit those, I'll be the one coming back up at the end where I will sort of sort through those and select. We may live in a democracy, but I'm not a democracy. So, and we will have to end right at 8:10. Senator Sasse has to catch a flight back to DC. I guess he has to be a senator in the morning. So we're so glad you're here, and Dr. Ryken will come now and, oh wait, I'm supposed to pray, aren't I? That's right, yep. Let me open up a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for the time we have here. We thank you for the opportunity we have to gather together, to think, reflect, deliberate. We thank you for Senator Sasse and Governor Haslam and their service. We pray that you bless our evening tonight and bless their words. In Christ's name we pray, amen.
Welcome, everyone. We are so glad that you can join us for this special event on living faithfully in the public square. And it's my honor this evening to introduce two distinguished guests who in so many ways exemplify our theme. Ben Sasse serves as the United States Senator for Nebraska, representing the Republican Party. Before being elected to the Senate, Ben received his PhD in history from Yale University and spent 5 years as a college president at Midland University. A college presidency is not the only thing that we share in common. The senator and I first connected when we were both students at Oxford and later collaborated in working together at the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. A best-selling author, Senator Sasse has written on topics highly relevant for our discussion tonight, including the challenges that young people face in our culture, the paradox of loneliness and collapsing local community, precisely at the time that the digital revolution makes many Americans some of the richest people in human history. Bill Haslam, also a Republican, served as the 49th governor of Tennessee from 2011 to 2019. In 2014, he was reelected as Tennessee's governor with the largest margin of victory in modern Tennessee history. Under his leadership, the state was recognized as a national leader in education, economic development, efficient and effective government, and fiscal strength. You should also know that formerly he was the parent of a Wheaton student. In 2021, Governor Haslam published a book also so very relevant to our theme this evening entitled Faithful Presence, The Promise and the Peril of Faith in the Public Square. Both of our guests are interested in vocation, in education, and the transformation that the gospel brings to all of life. Our skilled moderators this evening are Dr. Vince Bacote, professor of theology and author of The Political Disciple, A Theology of Public Life, and Dr. Amy Black, professor of political science and author of Honoring God in Red or Blue, Approaching Politics with Humility, Grace, and Reason. Will you please join me in giving a warm Wheaton welcome to our distinguished guests.
Good evening, and thanks so much for joining us. Let me start with, could you each share a couple of examples of some of your greatest joys serving in the public square?
Well, thank you, Amy, and thank you, Phil. Thanks to all of you for making time for us. Wheaton is an incredibly special place. This is a Mecca institution for those of us who grew up in and around evangelicalism, so I'm delighted to be here. I would say that at a day job level, one of my greatest joys is the work I have on the Senate Intelligence Committee. I sit on the Intelligence, Finance, Judiciary, and Budget committees, but the Intelligence Committee doesn't have cameras, so politicians tend to act act a little bit less like boars and beasts trying to camera hog. And the Intelligence Committee concerns itself with a lot of work that relates to our national security positioning in the era of not just a digital revolution in general, but a technology race with the Chinese Communist Party in particular. So at a day job level, Intelligence Committee work is definitely at the top of the list. But one of my favorite things about getting to represent Nebraska is that I get to work alongside people. I'm kind of a workaholic who loves to work out and sweat. And normally, if you just showed up and said, hey, I'd like to be a garbage man today, people would be like, you're kind of weird, you don't have any skills. But when you're senator and you show up and you want to ride the back of a garbage truck or do ag manufacturing or vend at Husker sporting events, you tend to get away with it. So I do a lot of manual labor. I don't get paid for any of it, but I get to show up and kind of do micro like imitations with dirty jobs, and that's a pretty great part of my life.
So like Ben, I'm really pleased to be here. Last time I was in the chapel, I was sitting here, and my son was graduating in 2007, and Wheaton was very formative in his life, and his best friends, he would say, are still the friends that he made here today. So a couple answers to your questions. I'm a former governor, and as the Australians say, rooster yesterday, feather duster today. So it's interesting. I was also the mayor of my hometown, and I was ordering lunch the other day, and the guy taking the orders kept looking and said, I know you from somewhere. He kept saying, where? And I kind of tried to play the game with him, finally said, I'm Bill Haslam. And he goes, no, that's not it. So you learn. But anyway, so people do forget you real quick, but also we became the first state to institute a program of free community college and technical school for everyone. And probably once a week, I'll be somewhere and somebody will grab me and say, hey, my son or daughter got to go to college because of that program. And so the bigger things you can do in public office, you get to see some of the lasting impact even after you leave office. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, I just really do. I know there's a lot of kind of discouragement and disenchantment, legitimately so, with the public arena today. But it's also an incredible chance to make a difference. I think one of the ways that God wired us is we all want to have a life that counts for something. And I just kind of always, the chance to sit around a table with a senior staff of people who are committed to saying, how can we really improve the quality of people's lives in Tennessee and mean it? Just kind of that rare joy of being harnessed together.
What are some of the biggest temptations facing Christians in public life? And what are some of the things you do to try to avoid them?
We'll take turns going first. I always say to this questions like this, it's the same as the temptations in other roles, except this one is just more visible feeling. And so part of the problem when you're in office is, particularly in today's world, people either treat you like you're the world's greatest or you're pond scum, and you're one or the other. You're never in between. And so the difficulties are when people treat you like pond scum, you want to fire back at them and to remind yourself that person's created in the image of God. And when they treat you like you're the world's greatest thing ever, to remember the humility of, well, I'm actually not. I've messed up about 7,300 times today. And so balancing that, the picture that we all have of ourselves of we're created in the image of God, and yet we're fallen and broken people, and all that's just intensified when you're in office.
I'll agree with and underscore all of that, and maybe add a small ninth commandment point. When you have a job in public life, so many people want to use words to tell a story that's a lot bigger than the reality of what they're really accomplishing every day. And one of the ways you folks navigate through that space of creating word pictures about grand accomplishments that are often really an intent to potentially maybe introduce a piece of legislation that probably has a 96% chance of not passing, and if it does, being poorly implemented and costing way too much and coming in way too late. And so a lot of folks in public life aren't telling the truth truth very often. And so there tends to be a competition of words that leads to a lot of bearing of false witness. And I think one of the best ways to have accountability with that is to have a lot of friends and accountability partners who aren't really into politics, and they live normal lives, and they look at everybody in politics peacocking around all the time, and they're like, man, those people are full of nonsense. And you want your words to be true, and have your yes be yes, your no be no, and your construction on other people's attempts and their motives to be a lot more charitable, not a lot more disparaging.
So what are some spiritual insights that you think Christians can bring to the table that can maybe reduce some of the division and turn down the temperature of politics? Some suggestions?
Well, I think just the grand, I say just, as if it's simple. It's a simple insight. It's hard to live out in a world of people living east of Eden, but believing that everyone is an image bearer of the eternal God pretty much transforms your entire perspective of what you're up to every day. If you think 7.8 billion people on earth are all created in God's image, it creates a different set of pulls on you to have a longer term perspective. Bill's great, and his book is wonderful at talking about the humble perspective Christians need to bring to these callings. And politicians are supposed to be public servants. They're not supposed to think of themselves as better than other people in a ruling posture. We have delegated authority for a temporary calling to serve in this space, and the vast majority of things politics claim it's going to do, it fails at doing. So having a humility about trying to maintain a public framework for ordered liberty so that people can live out the lives where they actually live, it flows from having a sense of the dignity of people that you're serving in these jobs.
One of the dangers of doing things with Ben is I've stolen so many things from his book that I attributed it to him the first 4 or 5 times I quoted him, and after that I figured it was done. So I've kind of forgotten they were his, and I realized like I'm getting ready to say, oh no, hold on a minute, but. Two things that Ben touched on, then two more, or one more. It does change everything if you think the person on the other side of the argument is created in the image of God. It just does. And we as believers, we don't have the option of hating that person. We just don't. And in today's world where being able to own the other side with snarky Twitter takedowns is at a premium, what we need to show folks that no, that's not what it's like when you really see the other person as an image bearer. So that's first. Second is knowing that we are, Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, means that we might not have it exactly right. I might be wrong, not just in how I treat my fellow brother or sister, but I also might be wrong in my conclusion about this, whatever the policy we're discussing. I think that the last thing, and here's the other advantage we bring to the table as believers. We're and people. We believe in truth and love in a world that says, I'm a truth teller, and they celebrate. I'm the one that says the hard truth, but they don't have an ounce of love in them. And then we're also people that believe in mercy and justice. And as a former governor who had to make decisions on giving people pardons or clemencies or exonerations, I thought that'd be so easy. You'll bring me a problem and I can deal with it in a merciful and just way. And I figured out I couldn't do it. But what I finally did, we have a picture of mercy and justice at the same time in the cross. And so the last thing I'd say is that as Christian, we should be and people. We're truth and love, and we're mercy and justice at the same time because we have pictures of that.
It's been touched on a little bit, but I think I'd love to hear you both elaborate a little bit more on this. How do you recommend we respond to Christians who are cynical about politics and those who think Christian faithfulness requires an avoidance of politics? As you noted, we're in one of those moments when for some people they're like, that's it, we should just check out of politics because it's, the undertow is too great.
So, every now and then God uses specific things that kind of grab your attention and make you go, aha, and help you make a decision. What made me first decide to run for mayor after lots of prayer and conversations with friends and my wife and lots of other folks was a passage in Jeremiah 29. And to shorten the story, people of Israel are being held captive in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's the king, a really, 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 really bad guy. And everybody's, like I said, in bondage. Jeremiah, they took everybody that they thought was of value to Babylon, but they didn't think prophets were of much value, so they leave Jeremiah in Jerusalem, and he writes to them. And I always say, if I'm being held captive, I hope you write and tell me, we're coming to get you quick, keep your head down, we'll be there as quick as we can. But Jeremiah writes and says, get used to it, you're going to be there a while. And he says, I want you to build houses and plant gardens and have your children marry and have their children marry. And then Jeremiah 29:7 says, but seek the welfare of the place where I have called you, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. And I would say that that's what we're called to do. Whether you're a plumber or a pastor or a missionary or a mayor, whatever it is, you're called to seek the welfare of that place where you've been called, even if it feels like this is really foreign territory. It'd be hard to get more foreign than Babylon. So I'd say if you're cynical about where the world is today and you think like, this is just not me, it's not who I am, that might be and is probably where you were called to.
Yeah, so in addition to affirming the calling to the place and time where we each find ourselves in God's providence, I would also say, and I'm not trying to affirm the cynicism, but it is odd how many Christians conclude that thinking politics are really broken means that therefore you should quit, as opposed to thinking maybe you should show up and roll your eyes a little bit. Because I don't mean it too cynically when I say roll your eyes, but the reality is 86% of Americans are not paying attention to politics on a daily basis. And so one of the reasons our politics are so weird is that by far the most overrepresented people are the loudest, angriest, loneliest, most online people who are least representative of regular people who are trying to live in their neighborhood, coach Little League and raise their kids well. And so I actually think if you recognize that a huge part of what's wrong in our politics is performative grandstanding and kind of clickbait nonsense and own the libs or own the conservatives or have the great put down, it's partly just because so many people have already failed to fulfill their calling to be a citizen who shows up in a republic. And showing up doesn't mean you have to show up and say, well, I'm either not engaged in public life as a citizen, or if I show up, this has to be my core identity. I think America works best when a whole bunch of people have a one cheer for politics view, which is, this is not the heart of who I am or what my identity is as a citizen, but I'm really grateful that we have order in a broken world where there are a lot of people in a chaotic East of Eden sense who would like to steal your life, your liberty, and your stuff. It's pretty great when God gives us order and stability so you can go to bed at night and not be afraid that glass is coming crashing in tonight. But that partly works because more people show up and say, now what are the fundamental basic things we should get done through the grittiness of what is secular politics that is not going to bring about the eschaton, but can maintain public order for a longer period. So I think we need a lot of people to show up and not go from 0 cheers for politics to 3 cheer for politics zeal, but a lot more sort of healthy middle brow. I'm not saying Eisenhowerian in a center right, they'll all defend center right, but an Eisenhowerian kind of, we need a little more boring normalness in politics.
So this may fit along with that one cheer for politics, we'll see, but I'd be interested in how both of you would answer. How do you prioritize the different private and public roles that you have in life? So you're a senator or you're a governor or you're a mayor, but you're also a father, a husband, a grandfather. What roles are most important and how do you decide how to navigate that?
Yeah, so not to go all Kuyperian here when we have an actual scholar, but I think clearly if you think through our multiple different callings and multiple different identities, I start with awareness of myself, Romans 5, I'm in union with Adam and his sin and creation, and I have union with Christ as my only hope. And so my churchmanship and my theological commitments, my self-identification organization as someone who needs the great physician has to be first. And then I think my callings as a husband and father are second. And then I want to be a citizen, but I also need to be a breadwinner. And I don't want to identify those two callings because I don't think anybody in public life can do a very good job of serving their constituents if they're committed to being at least 51% popular every moment. You need people who think there was a campaign season and now there's a governance season, and what people delegated to me is the responsibility to serve in this public office for a time, and they may well get to fire me. I don't plan to do this for my life, but I did run for re-election last year, and I don't think I would have been able to try to be as faithful and effective in my job over 6 years if every moment my main goal was to stick my finger in the wind and figure out if I was popular at that moment. So I think it's really important for people in American public life, in our system of constitutional government, to see themselves as having temporary delegated authorities, and they're just fine with moving on from this job. So I'm a conservative, and I'm a Republican, and I'm a senator for a time, but none of those things rise to the level of my familial commitments, and those are still subordinate to my theological identity.
Like I said, as the president said, Ben hung out at Oxford and Yale, and I wasn't there, so I'll go speak at a more life hack level, if you will. Ben, I also...
When anybody from Tennessee says, "Aw, shucks," cover your wallet. Bless your heart.
But so I'll give an example from... Yeah. I'll give an example from Ben's life, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things you figure out to do, like, well, okay, part of the time I'm going to commute from Nebraska, and part of the time I'm going to bring my whole family to D.C., and we're going to do that. So there's certain hacks, if you will, that we figured out how to do both. And one of the things I learned as governor is, okay, if they said, listen, we really need you to do X, Y, Z, and I'd say, okay, I'll do that, but that Friday, I said I'd be home to see grandkids at 5:30 or 6 or whatever it is. I'll do whatever you want. You just got to get me home by 6. And one of the things about being in office is they'd figure out how to do it. And there's some, like I said, there's some ways to say, I'll do that, but here's what I need out of you. And so I'd sit down with our scheduling department when we met every month, and I'd block off and say, I'll do whatever you want in this time, but this time right here, you're not getting, and we're going to do X, Y, Z. So it's really, again, it's no different. Well, I should say, it's a little different than most real-world jobs in that you have maybe more requests, but you also have more resources and more things that you can help you figure out how to get it done.
How should Christians approach relationships with politicians from the other side of the aisle? And what are the spiritual insights that make those relationships possible?
Well, I mean, one, as we both said earlier, you've got to recognize created in the image of God. You've got to start there. You've got to also say they're not the enemy. I mean, as believers, we don't think the people on the other side of the political aisle are the enemy. They're just not. The enemy is the father of lies, and it's not the folks on the other side. And I think the third thing, like I said, and I said it before, but the first person I ever worked for politically was a United States Senator from Tennessee named Howard Baker. And Baker was Majority Leader of the Senate, went on to be Reagan's Chief of Staff, was Ambassador to Japan. He was from a little town north of Knoxville called Huntsville, population 1,200. And so he kept a lot of his country colloquialisms, but one of those was, always remember the other fella might be right. And like I said, I think there's a biblical basis in that too.
I'll add one detail that maybe is across the aisle, but not necessarily just colleagues, because I agree with what Bill said, so I'll try to add something to it. I think it's really important. This is more of a sociological than an anthropological or theological insight. But I think it's important to recognize we live through a time when institutions are being massively disrupted. And akin to industrialization, urbanization, mass immigration from 1870 to 1920, the institutions that America had in 1870 were not working very well by 1880 or 1890, and it felt like cities weren't going to be habitable. And it felt like America was coming apart in 1890. By 1920, things felt pretty healthy and stable again. And there was a revivification in the sense that lots and lots of new institutions were created. The Sunday school movement, the YMCA, the Rotary Club, the just civic service organizations, I mean broadly. There was a recreation of human capital institutional thickness in American cities that previously had seemed to be connected only to rural New England agrarianism, small towns. And cities figured out how to rebuild social capital. I think we're going through a similar moment, and we recognize that everything's coming apart, but we don't see a lot of the flowering yet of new institutional foundings. And our analog, and I think it's an accelerant as well, what's happening in the digital revolution is at least as big as what was happening in the Industrial Revolution, and it's making our extant institutions mostly outmoded, and we're going to build new ones. But we don't know what that's going to look like yet, but it's not really worth having too much of your identity tied to these political parties, for instance. And I say this as somebody, I recognize that people may be all across the political continuum here. I'm the third or fourth or fifth most conservative member of the Senate by voting record. Out of 100 people, I'm pretty far to the right, but I'm not very partisan because I think these institutions are frankly really, really crappy. Like the Democratic and Republican parties are not impressive institutions, and they're not persuading or winning anybody. So I'm not going to invest much of my identity either in being a Republican or in being an anti-Democrat, because that just seems like a fool's bet. So the theological points that Bill's been making are more important, but also just at an institutional level, we're living through a time of collapse, and we're going to need to build new institutions. And so it would be very weird at a time when you're going to want to recruit people to a new kind of civic vitality and new wave of institutions that need to be founded in this country. Why would I want to alienate a lot of Democrats in Nebraska or anywhere else just because they might have slightly different marginal tax rate policy than I have?
Let me add one more thing I'll say about I love that last point. I think one thing that we should all think about, regardless where you're on the political spectrum, is to give a little grace to the other side if they're in a ruling situation. I'll tell you a story. Every year, the president, whoever's in office, has all the governors of all the states, and then all the cabinet, the vice president, everybody, to a black tie dinner at the White House. The Marine band plays. It's when the United States of America puts on the full dog. That's kind of what it's really a cool night, and it's a full. Whoever's at your table is somebody really interesting. And one year, it was President Obama's last year. And, he knows I'm a Republican. The guy I'm sitting next to is, I won't say who it is, but he was a senior official in the Obama administration, had been, worked for the Democrat National Committee before that, long-term Democrat. And I said, what do you know now that you wish you'd known 8 years ago? He said, I wish I'd known how hard this is. He said, I wouldn't have been so hard on George W. Bush. He said, don't get me wrong, I still disagree with so many of his policies, but I didn't understand how complex and difficult the issues are. And while I think we do need to have a certain cynicism about, people's political motives, we also should recognize that this stuff's not easy. And I learned really early in office, particularly being governor, by the time a problem got to me, there were two really good arguments to be made. And it wasn't nearly as clear as I always thought it, or wished it was.
So those are great points, which I really appreciate. And we want to foster those kinds of positive relationships and recognize how hard the work of governing is. But what about those times when you're going to genuinely, deeply disagree with someone? How can you offer a robust criticism that is still humble, still recognizing that we see through a glass darkly? Is there a line that you might say, this is what I will not cross, or principles that you keep in mind for how you can see that person as made in the image of God, honor them as such, but also try to make that important critical point?
two thoughts, and I'll admit, Bill's done this longer than I have, and when you're a governor, you're accountable for outcomes, and so he's done it more effectively as well. In the 7 years I've worked in D.C., Republicans and Democrats haven't gotten much done where you tried to persuade anybody else. It's been pretty unilateralist on both sides when attempts have been made. But two small thoughts. The first is, I think it's very useful if you're at the level, it's almost like the way if you're arguing with one of your kids and you realize that this is no longer a kid who's like sub 10 years old and you're in the commander phase, and it's maybe not the kid's 10 to 17 and you're kind of in the coach phase. It's when the kid's 17, 18 or older and you're realizing they're kind of moving into the place where I'm just a consultant. Instead of just differing on the issue, I think it works to sometimes step back and say, I have a bunch of ideals that are driving why I'm arriving at the policy position I'm at. I think you have a bunch of ideals that are why you're arriving at the policy position you're at, even though I think you're a knucklehead, and that policy position is not a good policy position. Of course, the aspirations behind it include a whole bunch of ideals, some of which I agree with. So it's worth to just say, I hear you first, because here's what I think you're trying to accomplish. I don't necessarily think it's going to work, but I affirm that aspirational ideal, that the principle that drove that policy commitment. I think that de-escalates a lot of it, sheds some light instead of just heat on the moment. But I think the second thing that makes our moment strange is we have so little shared American understanding of what our long-term goals are in common that institutions are being consumed. They're being set on fire as people think the end almost always justifies the means. And so they're willing to burn things down and use authorities and violate norms that surprise people. And so I think it's useful to also have to reaffirm the logic at a process level by which you think you have authority to make the decision you're making when you're rejecting someone else. Because it isn't just, I disagree with your policy. And again, I'm saying this mostly to throw up a fat fastball to Bill because he actually had power. I work in a body that mostly just wants to be a commentariat nowadays. Most of the United States Congress doesn't actually want to have power. They want to punt powers to the executive branch so that they can serve as critics. But it's useful to outline the logic by which you actually think you have the authority to execute this decision.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add except that I don't think it's unspiritual to disagree with someone. I mean, there's just you and, I mean, if we sat and talked long enough, we could come up with something we disagreed with each other on. It is, unspiritual for me to treat you as in any way, not created in the image of God. And so, I mean, I think you have to come back to there. I think the other thing I'd say is this. I think Ben does a great job of this in his books, talking about what we've lost in terms of knowing the person who lives next door to us and across the street from us, et cetera. We've actually lost that in politics too. People just don't know each other. And so one of the things we worked hard to do while we were in office is we, in small groups, had each one of the legislators to dinner. And I was shocked at how little they knew each other. They're like, wow, you're kidding. You were in the Army? I was in the Army too. Those conversations happened every time. And how much it helped us. We kind of had a no discussing issues during dinner policy, but how much those dinners of getting to know each other helped us working out policy arguments down the road. So I think my point would be that person in your office who you end up in an argument with over politics all the time, try to first maybe have lunch or dinner where you talk about something besides politics, because, like I said, there's a good chance the things they truly care about aren't that political argument.
Well, we're here at Wheaton College, an institution of higher education. What do you guys see as the role of Christian higher education today in this moment?
I would say this. If Wheaton can produce graduates who have learned how to think critically with a biblical foundation, you'll play an incredibly important role in this country. And the ability to do both of those, think critically with a biblical foundation, you don't find that many people who have learned how to do that. And an institution like this, with the reputation it has, and the commitment it has can really be one of the very few places in the country where that happens.
Yeah, I'm sure you all know this, but you are at an incredibly special institution. I mean, this is a thick place where I don't know what all the tradition is now about spring bells on campus or something, but the amount of people I know in life who had their marriages set here is pretty astounding. I don't think there's a dude in the second row who's raising a fist, and I don't know if that means he's already engaged or if that was some sort of a prayer, And it's a seriously disproportionate number of marriages I know on earth that started on the Wheaton campus. Those of you who are blessed to be here now, congrats. And those of you who are donors who are helping subsidize the other people, including the wannabe Mary guy in the front row, thanks for your service. But I also do think it's really important to think about what the role of Christian higher ed is going to be in a world where lifelong learning is more and more of an obligation. I think we've always had a calling as people created not just in God's image, but also to think his thoughts after him. There's always been a calling of the Christian mind, but now at an economic vocational level, lifelong work is going to end. Mark Andreessen had a really seminal essay in the Wall Street Journal about a decade ago, I think it was 2011, called "Software is going to Eat the World." And it was true and powerful in 2011, and it was more powerful and true in 2015, and more in 2020, and even more now. And humans are smart, and we're really good at automating repetitive tasks. And when you get to a place where big data allows a world of marginal computation to become free, there are a whole bunch of things that used to seem like computers and robots could never do, and more functions are going to be automated. And so it means that 35 and 40 and 45-year-olds are going to have to get retrained over and over and over again in life. Again, at the level of life of the mind, and the fact that God, to quote Calvin, uses creation as the theater of his glory, there was always a reason to want a Wheaton education. But at the level of economic vocationalism, how you provide for your family a half a generation and a generation and a generation and a half in the future, everybody's going to have to get good at figuring out how to be retrained. And I think Christian higher education has a really important role to play in thinking about lots of stopping points that are well beyond age 18 to 23.
Let me throw in one example. As I said, my son went here, and as 21 or 22-year-olds, he and 15 other guys said, you know, we're broke college students, but hopefully we won't always be this way. And they kind of made an agreement that they were going to get together every year, and everybody would put in X% of their earnings, and then they would meet as a group and talk about where they wanted to give those funds to, with the idea that, hey, they're going to build an idea of a culture of giving, and then second, of kind of educated giving, if you will, and this idea that this money's not ours to begin with. And so literally 15 years later, the 15 guys all still meet. They get together for 3 or 4 days every year, and they listen to different proposals from different missions or charities, and then they all give X% of what they make. And I don't think they come away with that same kind of commitment from many other institutions. And so to me, it's how do we take kingdom values, educate ourselves so we understand the need and our responsibilities and possibilities, and then go out in the world and use those.
And that's a great example, and maybe a couple others, but I'm looking out and we have a number of folks here that, including Nick, who are current students, and there are many things we're trying to do here, but the most important, I think, is we're trying to train the next generation of followers of Christ. So what are some things that places like Wheaton College can do to nurture and train that next generation to be better Christ followers?
Am I up again?
I think you are. I think I went first and last.
I think he's just wanting to buy some clock. And I got to admit, I need to buy some clock for a second too. So I just want to go back to the when the question was, how do you not demonize? I'm oversimplifying the question, but how do you not demonize people on the other side of the aisle? And what's the way when you disagree with somebody to disagree agreeably, winsomely. And since then, I've noticed that one of my college roommates is here. And Ryan Gaynor, one of my roommates, he and I were wrestlers when we went to school in Boston, and all of our other roommates were football players. And whenever we'd be trying to have a long sort of Christian ethics fight working through some issue, if we got to a place where this roommate of ours, who was an all Ivy League offensive tackle, thought we'd gone too long and too nerdy, he would just go, "Oh, I'm going to crush your skull." And I think that's the wrong way to handle it in politics.
Why do you say that?
Is the Big Dave solution. Sorry, I needed old home week with my buddy. Hi, Ryan. Where were we?
We were going to cede the microphone to Ryan so he could tell college stories about you.
So if we're talking about nurturing our students to be followers of Christ, maybe that's not the way to do it. What might be some positive things we can be thinking about? What can we be cultivating here as we're working with our college students?
I mean, you have a thick community where you break bread with people. You know that what happens in the seminar room is incredibly important, but it's not the end of your education. It happens in the dorm room, it happens in the dining hall, it happens on the playing fields, it happens in your outdoor activities, it happens in service project and Habitat for Humanity, it happens on short-term mission trips, it happens in the outdoor program before freshmen get here that I think some of your students still go through. The diversity of recognizing incarnational living and the bodily elements that come with wrestling through the life of the mind and how you live a life of gratitude to God across our remaining years before our rooster becomes a feather duster. Was that the phrase? I knew there was a Tennesseeism in there somewhere. But there's a thickness to this community that's incredibly special, and I wish more people could experience what you all get here.
Not a lot to add there beyond what I said earlier about, I do think teaching how to think biblically and critically, there's not a lot of places doing that. And you have the chance to do that and have those discussions in a way that I think can be very formative.
At the institutional level, in terms of the college itself, how does the college do things that sort of fulfill the call of loving our neighbor?
I think that the first thing is, it's interesting, there's a couple of Christian colleges in Nashville, and while I was governor, I loved the way that they had become part of their communities. So there were, kids' basketball leagues that played in their, student facilities on weekends, and there were literal community meetings on campus, I feel like every time I turned around. So part of that is saying, like, how does the community around here feel about us? Are they glad that Wheaton is a part of, this town? Are they glad that Wheaton College is part of the town of Wheaton? And are we living in such a way that we're light around here, and people think of that even if they don't agree with us at all theologically? Would be one very practical way to start that.
Another one similar, but internally, do we model living a world where you recognize that thinking God's thoughts after him means recognizing that there's a lot more than I'm ever really going to understand this side of the eschaton. And it means that I can be amazed at the good, the true, and the beautiful as I understand it in some moment. This is not an argument for relativism, but it's an argument for humility, that there are going to be a whole bunch of people that come from different places here and have different perspectives. And it turns out you don't have to get to full agreement with everything to still love somebody. And so the way that you can have a seminar discussion that is vigorous, and at the end you can say, man, I don't know that I'm right. I'm not sure that you're wrong, but I'm pretty sure that you're wrong. But I still can give you a hug. The world doesn't see much of that.
So Governor Haslam, you've written about, and I think this is so helpful, the distinction between using God for our own desires and being used by God. What are some practices that you think can help us avoid using God for our own desires and instead seeking to be used by God?
So some of that's kind of a product of your circumstances. Tennessee is still enough of retains enough of a Southern Christian culture, if you will, that, being a churchgoer is a good thing politically. And identifying as a Christian is still a positive politically. That's not true in many parts of the country. But one of the things that I noticed real quick is there were a whole lot of folks that, in their commercials appeared to be where, boy, the church is the main part of their lives. And I just knew that wasn't true. And so, that's one example of using God instead of being used by God. And I think there's lots of ways that we can, that for folks in my particular place and circumstance, that was the temptation. But I think we tend to do that in a lot of different ways, is how can I use God in this situation to get what I want? And that's a really, really dangerous place to be, because we feel self-righteous because we're clothing it in God language, but there's nothing pure in heart about it.
Senator Sasse, you've talked about how we need a politics of vision, not a politics of grievance. What do you mean by that? And how do we cultivate a politics of vision?
Well, I clearly believe that no government, no state is going to bring down heaven, is going to bring heaven forward into the present. States are secular tools to maintain order in a world that's broken. And yet, we are incredibly blessed to live in a nation where, though we've not lived up to our creed ever, we've had for 240 years, pushing 240 years, an aspirational creed that says we believe in universal human dignity. And we believe in a world where power isn't the center of things. Power is just a tool to maintain order. But the really interesting things are done by love and by persuasion and by entrepreneurship and by neighborliness and by building. The really interesting stuff in the world doesn't come because of power. Power just maintains a lot of the chaos at the door, so keeps it outside the door so that you can build a better mousetrap or design a great app or invite people to join the Rotary Club or come to the Habitat for Humanity project with you or join your sports club. But really, so that you can invite people to dinner and tell them about the fact that I violated the law, and yet in heaven, my account is not only free of all of my negative account, I'm not just debited, I'm not just atoned for, but by the imputation of Christ, I'm also given credit for having fully fulfilled the law, though I didn't do that. That's a crazy story. We believe truly angular, weird, bizarre things, and to get to tell somebody that story, you need there to be some order. And so having a politics of aspiration and vision seems to me to start with having a sense not just of the dignity of people that keeps me from wanting to violate the ninth commandment and bear false witness against them, but the opportunity to commune with them and build with them and worship with them. And it seems to me that one of the things that's obvious in our time is that part of the reason there's such vitriol and anger in the very small share of people who are paying attention to politics is because they assume that everything is in decline and there can't be any rebuilding. And I don't think in our heart of hearts any of us really believe that. We just live at a time when out competing people on social media to explain what a victim I am and how I've been sinned against and how much grievance there is that I need to sort of, vent my spleen about. That's really boring. And so there's a surprising bit of silver lining good news in the fact that our politics are so negative and so grievance-based and so boring right now. It's pretty great news that most people check out of that. They're checking out of that because that isn't compelling. That doesn't speak to their heart, and that doesn't really give you any sense of what the future can be. You're not going to, again, we're not bringing heaven by politics, but there's a huge opportunity to create a space by which the next set of institutions can be built in this age.
So going back to questions for both of you, so we'll start again with you, Senator, since you just mentioned social media. What are some of the particular temptations that arise from the role of social media in politics? And what are maybe some things we can do to try to avoid those temptations?
Yeah, so I'll broaden the question just a tiny bit, if I may. So not just politics, but one of the things that social media does is it pulls us out of the place where we're actually called to live that moment. We're allowed to take a big chunk of our consciousness and invest it in something far away, probably something that because of, something deep in human psychology, there's an evolutionary sense we all have to flee the new danger. We focus more on negative than positive news. There's infinite studies from lots and lots of disciplines about our tendency to focus more on negative than positive things. But the farther we move it away from ourselves, the more passive we are. And actually, we're called to be active agents. We're called to do stuff. We're called to move and to build. We have bodies. We have emotions. We have energy. We have vigor. And I think that social media pulls us out of our moment and takes us far away to something that's more negative and where we have less agency. And so I want to say this as somebody who believes there's lots of great stuff that comes from the digital revolution as well. Maybe I'll back up 1 second. It's useful to just think about where we are in the evolution of technologies. There used to be mainframe computers that were almost the size of this room that did targeting and therefore won us the Cold War. But no individual or no local business got access to it. Then you went from mainframes to places where you could rent some access to a mainframe. Then you went to desktops. Then you went to laptops. Then you went to mobile devices. Then you went to mobile phones. Now we have wearable devices. Very soon, we're going to have a hard challenge before us of deliberating, what do you do in the face of implantable technologies? Because lots of it is going to be so compelling that we're not going to want to say no to all of it. We're 5 to 20 years away from a moment where we're going to inject tiny little supercomputers in our bloodstream, and they're going to swim around and diagnose and repair certain kinds of cancers before we were symptomatic and had any sense that we had those cancers. So there are going to be technologies that go from mobile to wearable to implantable. The ones that scare me are the ones that try to capture our affections and our attentions. And I'm going to be excited about the part where in augmented reality, you're watching a sporting event, and wherever you look, you can get all the probability statistics of every wide receiver on that play. What are you doing throwing that crossing pattern when that flag was wide open? That guy who's playing secondary there, he's terrible at defending against this route, right? Like, there are going to be things that social media will want to be football coach. There are going to be things that are going to be not only hard to resist, but there'll be pieces of them we'll want the benefits of. But I think it's super important to be aware of the fact that we live in a world where social media is free precisely because you're the product. Right? Like, if you're not paying for it, it's because they're monetizing you and your attentions and your affections and your rage. And that's a really, really dangerous thing. And so I think we need to get a lot more sophisticated in our diet and how we think about our consumption of social media. I'll stop here because I've gone on too long, but I'll just say one anecdote. At different times for sports and parenting and dead animal Twitter, I was very active on social media or on Twitter for a while, and then I realized it was just such a cesspool of all the political stuff. You tweet a picture of your kid winning a track meet, and somebody'd be like, "Why do you hate this person who just died in Cleveland? How could you possibly be at a track meet? Somebody's dying somewhere." Yeah, but that isn't my calling. I'm not there. And so social media was so all-consuming. I'm now on my third more than 1 year long Twitter fast. And one day I had a meeting with Jack Dorsey, who was until recently the CEO of Twitter. And of course I should have known that he would be staffed up to know if I was active on Twitter or not, but it hadn't occurred to me. And I walked in and he's like, "What's wrong with you? You used to be really interesting on Twitter and now you're like blowing off our product for a year straight." And I said, "Listen, I think that political Twitter is a clear foretaste of hell. Sports Twitter, though, is a foretaste of the eschaton. And if I could just have sports Twitter and not political Twitter, I'm all in." And he said, "Oh, I'm so glad you recognize that political Twitter isn't the only Twitter." He goes, "It's rarely top 10 of all the Twitters." And I was like, "Really? I'm glad, but tell me more." And he goes, "Oh yeah, K-pop Twitter, by far the largest Twitter." Korean pop music is the most common form of Twitter.
Yeah, Ben did a great job there. And he actually ended
Bless your
not
heart,
with the
he said.
K-pop, but he did end it with what I was going to start and suggest is, I do think for all of us, whether you're 18 or 82, planning a fast from social media is just really good. And you'll be shocked how often you find yourself wanting to reach for the phone and realize, oops, I said I wouldn't do that for however many days. So that'd be my first thought. The second thought is somehow social media, I think the dangerous thing is we see everything that Ben talked about. We just don't see it for ourselves. And here's what I think has happened to us, in particular, I say us as believers. We've looked out and we've said in this social media, Twitter, even though politics is 10th, whatever, in this Twitter battle world, we can't just sit back and be silent because the other side's going to win the argument. And so all of a sudden we say the rules are different and we're going to play by those rules. And when somebody challenges us on it, we say, well, don't you understand that the stakes are so big here? If we don't, literally the future of the country and the soul of America is wrapped up in winning this argument online. And so we allow ourselves to act in ways that we would never say was okay for our kids to act on social media. And we give ourselves a waiver because so much is at stake in this argument. But the reality is we don't allow ourselves waivers in other areas. We don't say in your business, like, listen, you need to act in an ethical way in your business unless you get in trouble, unless the business starts to get, shaky financial, and then you can cut some corners. And we certainly don't say in your marriage, like, you need to be faithful unless the person in the next office is really hot, and then, then you get a waiver. Like, we don't give ourselves a waiver anywhere else in the way that we do in politics because we justify it with the ends, the ends justify the means. But there's just nothing biblical about that.
What does it mean to trust God's sovereignty in the public arena, and how does that influence your approach to your political work?
Well, this is one of those where I'm going to talk a better game than I played. I think what it means is you have to be okay running for office and not winning. You have to be okay making a proposal and have it not pass, or making an argument and have it that vote not win. In this sense of, well, what am I called to be faithful to right now, right here? And trusting that's the only thing that I need to be truly concerned about. Now, having said that, it's really, really hard. I mean, when something you really care about is being debated on and voted on, and you've stuck your neck out there and made a proposal and done it, I mean, it felt really, really personal to me. And I wasn't like sitting back and saying, well, I'm good with whatever God's will is on this. It all felt really personal. And I think Ben will tell you, if you're at all like me, being a candidate is really, really personal and vulnerable. I don't know, like I said, maybe you had a depth to you that I didn't have, but when I ran for mayor the first time, I barely won, like 51 to 49. And then my first governor's race in the primary, that was a very competitive primary, and I had a stomach ache for 6 months. And I'd love to tell you I had, a sense of I'm going to trust God's will and how this works out, but the vulnerability you feel as a candidate is, only thing I compare it to is being in middle school and walking up to a lunch table and hoping the other kids will say, come sit with us, It's that kind of vulnerability. And it, like I said, personally, it was incredibly difficult for me to do that. So it doesn't change the fact that in my best moments, I could understand that if this is what, God's called me to, He's called me to be faithful and to try to walk that way.
Yeah, that's so well said. I mean, the cemeteries are filled with indispensable men, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it is not us who controls the outcome. This is not an excuse not to plan, of course, but we're called not to be anxious. Like Bill, I'll confess the stomach aches or night sweats or whatever at different moments in life where there are big policy challenges or where you have big personal political exposure. But at the end of the day, I'm called to say, give us this day our daily bread, and then be grateful that no sparrows or hairs fall from our head without the will of our Heavenly Father. And we aren't big enough to really drive these outcomes. We're called to be faithful and leave the results to God.
I have the privilege now to sort of throw a few questions to you from the audience, modified a little bit from this. I thought maybe to follow on from that last question, y'all might talk a little bit about your decision to go into public life. Both of you did things that were in the private sector for some number of years, and you had to make a decision to run for office. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that decision, that judgment. Like how did that come about? Yeah.
So I was kind of minding my own business, been in business for 20-something years, and some folks came up and said, why don't you run for mayor of Knoxville? And I literally laughed. I mean, it was like I laughed out loud, said, you totally got the wrong guy. And they said, well, think and pray about it. And it's hard to say no to thinking and praying about something. So I did, and then I thought, well, my savior will be my wife. Will say no way, and brought it up. And she said, I think we should think and pray about that. And and I went to a group of guys that I met with every Friday morning for 20 plus years, and they agreed. And before I knew it, I had kind of gotten to that point where it felt really clear to me that I was called to run for mayor. And I did it with a little bit of a stomach ache and anxiety we talked about before, but ran, didn't really like the campaigning, but I loved the job of being a mayor. And so when my 2 terms were nearing an end, there was an open seat for governor, and ran, and same thing, like 6 months to a year of campaigning that, stomach ache the whole time. But I knew there was a guy named Bill Frist who'd been a United States Senator, another majority leader, and Frist was thinking about running for governor, and we'd been friends for a while, and I said, well, if he runs, I'm not going to, but if he says he's not, then I will. And he called me like Christmas Eve of like 2 years before the race and said, I've decided not to run. And I still remember hanging up the phone and looking at Chrissy, and kind of, we had this like, okay, this is what I think we're called to do. It was difficult, but I've never felt anything that felt as much like calling. What's the Buechner's quote is, your calling is where the world's needs and your desires meet, or your gifts meet. And for me, that just felt like that's where they met.
I had been a college president for nearly 5 years, and the 130-year-old school had been through a lot of turmoil, and I came in to help lead a bit of a turnaround and reset, and it went well. We had a really good team. I was given more credit than I deserved, but I had put together the team, and so the alumni network of this college ended up kind of recruiting me into the race. And I'll be honest, mine wasn't as nobly thought out as Bill's. I thought, in part, that I wanted to just tell the truth on the campaign trail, and if that made you unelectable, that felt like a house money kind of fun way to explore running for office. And so I wasn't really planning to run when I went on a 14-stop, 45-day listening tour. And I just was kind of winging it and saying stuff I believed, and it turned out saying stuff that seemed like it might be political suicide was really popular with folks. And my wife and I decided that it might be fun for our kids to experience the diversity of Nebraska's 93 counties. They were 12, 10, and 2 at the time. And so we decided to live off a bus for the better part of 16 months. So it was like a great American road trip.
A friend of mine talked about that, ran for governor of Wyoming. This is 10, 12 years ago. And he really ran just kind of like, because I want to make some points. And then after a while, he got to where he was ahead. And the night before the election, his dad looked at him and said, hey, I think you're actually going to have to do this now.
So the audience would like to know whether either of you have considered further office.
I'm here tonight to endorse Bill Haslam for President of the United States.
I was actually going to raise my hand to be the vice president to President Sasse.
We have broken news. Thank you. For many of us, it feels as though our society is fraying at the edges. We have lots of evidence about polarization. Surveys suggest that both large numbers of Democrats and Republicans think the country would be better off if the other side was dead. Increasing numbers of people think that violence is a sort of an acceptable way to sort of further political views. Why do you think this is the case? What's the sort of the source of this? And two, I mean, what are a couple of things to do that we Christians should be about doing? And you can include us in the sort of part one if you wish.
Ben wrote a great book on this. I'm not just saying that, so go ahead and kick off.
Well, I'll try out a nerd construct, which is probably a dangerous thing to do when our clock is running low. But I'll try one thought out with you, because I've been wrestling with this a lot the last 6 months or so. In business, there's this concept called the iron triangle pick two. And it's whenever you have this sort of real hard riddle to solve, and you can solve most of it, but not all of it. The classic case of this in business school is retail food on the road. Every mom and dad who's driving a van with screaming hungry kids in the back knows this problem. You can get quality, you can get good price, or you can get speed, but you can't get all three. You can only get two. Right? The fast food industry, McDonald's, exists because parents basically said, hey, we're on a road trip, things are urgent here, I'd like to save money, and I need it fast, but we can come up with quality later. Everybody can eat broccoli tomorrow. We're going fast and cheap. You can also pick cheap and quality, but it just takes forever. Or you can get quality and you can get it fast, but it takes a ton of money. Right? So you have to sacrifice one of the three. I think we have an iron triangle pick two problem in America right now, where you can have a freedom-based polity, you can have a common culture, or you can have deep meaning, but you can't have all three. And so if we had a whiteboard, I'd put down in the southeast corner, put freedom-based polity, put at the top of your triangle common culture, and put down in the southwest corner deep community. Historically, the American answer, the humble politics, has been, I want freedom and I want deep meaning, but I get that we're not all going to believe the same things. We're not going to have a total common culture. It's sad. You'd like everybody to believe all the same stuff, but we don't think politics are going to solve every problem, and so we're willing to be humble and not think you can bring about heaven on earth. And so we were willing to sacrifice a true common culture in return for lots of plural deep meaning and a freedom-based polity. I think what's happened as the digital revolution in particular, but just consumerism more generally, the riches of all that we know, has undermined deep meaning. We all of a sudden live in Vegas. We have a common culture, and we have a freedom-based polity, but it's really alienating and lonely and shallow. And Vegas may be a fine place to go watch a sporting event or to have a weekend for March Madness or something, but it's not a place to raise your kids. It's not a place to plan for the future and to humbly reflect on our own mortality. And Vegas is lonely and alienating, and so a whole bunch of people are saying, well, maybe the problem was freedom. Maybe the problem is we have too much freedom, and we should use the power of the state to try to unite common culture with meaning again. And I think both the wokes and the most extreme violence-inclined MAGAs are roughly the same people. They want common culture and they want deep meaning, but they live in echo chambers where they believe that everybody believes what they believe, because in their echo chamber silos on social media, it does. And they're willing to give up a freedom-based polity if they could have more depth of meaning and more common culture. And I think the thing we've sacrificed is historic American civics. And so to your point about what we do to rebuild is, I think first you need to put not your trust in princes. We need to believe in theology. We need to believe in character and virtue. We need to be rebuilding institutions. We need more people to show up for a one cheer for politics perspective. But fundamentally, you need to not have the hope that politics is going to fulfill your deepest needs and longings. And right now we have a bunch of people, the loudest, angriest, loneliest on both the online right and the online left, who are willing to sacrifice freedom in return for solving all this fraying. The real thing we should be doing is civic Tocquevillianism of rebuilding locally and not putting your hope in distant politics.
So well said. Really, that's worth clapping for. And we're getting near the end, so I want to make the one point that when I talk to a group like this, I want to make certain I make. And there is a sense of the fraying of America, not just with the examples you gave, but with what Ben describes as deaths of despair, opiate and suicide deaths increasing. We can go through all the statistics. I saw where households that have made charitable gifts, the percentage has gone down like 16% in the last 18 years. You can see a lot of things like that. And the message I would have for tonight is this. Jesus is really clear. If the meat goes bad, it's not the meat's fault, it's the salt's. And we're the salt. And our call is to make certain that we preserve that meat from going bad. And the warning against it, the Spirit who's the disturber before the Comforter says, if the salt has lost its saltiness, it's good for nothing except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. And so as we look around and say, what's happened to this world? How's this happened? Jesus always starts with us. And that'd be my one word for tonight, is Jesus always starts with us when we look around at what's happened to the world around us.
Thank you. Just one last quick question. Number of wins for the University of Tennessee, the University of Nebraska next year, the football season.
Speaking of a culture of mediocrity,
You can tell he's no longer a current office holder.
that's right. Hey, we were 7-6 this year. We think we were 8-5. We got a bad call at the end of the game, so I'll go with 8 next year.
I was 36 years old before Nebraska had its first season in my life with fewer than 9 wins. My 10-year-old recently told me the average wins across his life has been like 4.7. So I'm reaching big, saying our over/under is 6.5.
On those optimistic notes, please join me in thanking.
Thanks, everybody.
Senator Sasse.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Edman. It's fun to be with you.